Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you the first of a few videos that I'm going to call Sensor Wars, where I'm going to take a look at the new Canon EOS R and how it compares to some of the competing options that you might be considering. One of the main ones that, of course, I'm going to be looking at in this series is seeing how it compares to the actual 5D Mark IV, which it seems to have at least a version of the sensor from the 5D Mark IV. But we're going to see if it's actually the exact same sensor or if there are some differences as a part of this. But also as a part of the series, I'm going to be giving you a look at how it compares to other sensors, like say from the new Fuji XT3 or from both the the Sony a6500 and A7R Mark III, which I'm filming on at the moment, and then seeing how it compares out with some of these other mirrorless type options as well. I understand that the probably most natural Sony competitor to put against would be the Sony a7 III, but since I don't actually have one of those, that's not a comparison that I can do. Fortunately, I do have the Fuji on hand, and I have, of course, some of the Sony bodies and the 5D Mark IV in my kit, and so I'll be doing a comparison with those. In this episode today, we're going to be looking at how the camera does at various ISO values. And so as you begin to crank that ISO up, we're going to see how it responds towards the upper limits and how far you can go before the sensor starts to fall apart. Or does it fall apart? Well, let's jump in, let's find out. So what we've got is the EOS R, which is going to be on the left, and then the 5D Mark IV on the right. Once again, we're using the same lens, 35mm f1.4L Mark II. And so at base ISO, I mean, we would expect everything to look really clean, and of course it does. Depth of field is roughly the same with these two lenses, and in terms of the amount of detail that's rendered, I would say, at least in this case, I like what I see from the EOS R just a little bit more. And you know, it's hard to read too much in here, even though I try to focus them identically. You know, you don't always get the exact same result. But anyway, in terms of the actual look of the image, it is, I would say, more similar than different than at base ISO. So we're going to keep an eye on this area here, kind of this out of focus dark area is where the most pattern noise kinds of show up. So just know as we go in, this is not pattern noise. Sometimes I do bokeh highlights here, and so these are lights to use for that. And so that's not anything weird going on in the background. I threw in a kind of a deep red here umbrella as a part of this setup, and lots of color to allow us also to see what it does with colors as we climb up the ladder here. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to jump right up to ISO 1600. I find that these days cameras really, there's not much of a difference until you get to ISO 1600, and sometimes not even there. And so we'll just skip the bottom stages here. Looking at the images at large, they look more similar than different. Metering, for whatever reason, it asks for a little less shutter speed with the EOS R compared to the 5D Mark IV. And however, I mean, they do tend to look like they're delivering a fairly similar image quality or exposure value here. It's only a third stop difference, and so it's not really significant anyway for a statistical purpose. So dark areas, we're not really seeing any new noise. I mean, here you can see the original patterns that were there, kind of the texture of the paper on the game there, but no noise introduced. Lots of detail rendered here, and in this dark area, I'm not seeing anything really showing up there. And once again, I would say there's a little bit better contrast on the actual texture of the grip there on the old camera. If we look up into our kind of dark area, there's a very, very, very fine noise pattern on both of them, but I mean, only detectable at a pixel level. Not really a whole lot to see here. They both look basically the same. So once again, we see the pattern continues, that we get a basically equal exposure value with a little bit faster a shutter speed on the EOS R. I'm going to, looking at tests that I've already looked at, go out on a limb and say that Canon has managed to milk a little more sensitivity out of this sensor, and I'll touch on that more in just a moment. So now we're at ISO 3200, ISO 3200. And so this is where sometimes you can begin to see a little bit of something, but at this stage, we're still seeing a very, very fine noise pattern, not a whole lot to see. I would say that our colors are still looking about similar, still lots of detail that is there. Looking over here, once again, I still prefer the contrast that I see on the grip there. Looking inside here, you can see a fine amount of noise that is on the mirror there, and I do think that there is the slightest bit more noise on the EOS R compared to the 5D Mark IV. At the same time, I also think it's delivering a little better degree of detail, and so that could also be a factor here as well. Once again, looking at the out of focus area, there's no color band or anything here that we're seeing, and reds look as they should. And so, I mean, again, more similarities than differences. At this stage, I would say a tiny bit more noise on the EOS R, but also a little bit more detail as well. Now, often at ISO 6400, you can start to see the early stages of breakdown, although modern cameras are really doing a remarkably good job with this. And so, once again, I wouldn't say there is a significant greater amount of noise than what we saw there before. And once again, detail is holding up quite well. Let's look over here on the old Spotmatic. And there still is a little bit better contrast for the EOS R, maybe a little bit more detail. Noise is a little bit more pronounced, as we've seen before. Looking up in the defocused area, you can see it's a little bit softer, and but at the same time, there's also, I would say, a little less contrast for the 5D Mark IV image as compared to the EOS R. And so that's your trade-off maybe when it comes to that. So now if we jump on up to ISO 12800, this is, for many people, this is probably the limit of where they feel comfortable in using cameras, I mean, based on tradition. At the same time, my tests have shown that modern cameras, you really can push them a little bit higher without a whole lot of penalty, as we're going to see here when it comes to ISO performance. So once again, I do find that, again, we have a little bit of a difference in the exposure value or how the camera is metered. Maybe contrast does still slightly favor the EOS R. As far as the noise goes here, at this stage, I would say that they kind of look fairly similar, and in some ways maybe the noise has crept up a little bit more on the 5D Mark IV. Patterning here still looks very good, nice detail. Looking at this mirror inside of here, what we can see is maybe a little coarser of noise compared to the 5D Mark IV. Looking out in this area though, more similar than different, and still no real apparent color banding showing up for either one. And so I'm not seeing anything major here to be concerned about. And I would say that looking at both of these on a global level, still very, very usable. Okay, so at ISO 25600, we're definitely, starting to push up into more noisy territory, but we can see sensor is still holding up pretty well here. I do think there is a little bit more noise I'm seeing from the EOS R compared to the 5D Mark IV. At the same time, color fidelity looks good, and if you look here, there's just a little bit more pronounced detail and a little bit better contrast on the whatever that is on the Puzzle Quest game. Similarly here, I mean, there is definitely some noise you can start to see here, but contrast is holding up well. And I also think that maybe color fidelity is holding up maybe a little better on the EOS R. And so the trade-off seems to be a little bit more noise, but then a little bit more detail and a little bit more contrast. I'm starting to see just the beginnings of a little bit of some green patterning there in the defocused area, a little bit more of blotchiness that starts to show up at higher ISO values. But here on the 5D Mark IV, you can also see some of these magenta blotches that aren't showing up quite as much on the EOS R. And so, You know, I don't know that one is particularly better than the other, but I will say as far as noise, if you're concerned by noise, the EOS R seems to have a little bit more, but it also trades off that by having a little more detail and contrast and perhaps a little bit better image punch still at that higher ISO value. So let's look at the upper limits here. Now, there is a little bit of a difference between these two in that the native ISO range goes up to 40,000 on the EOS R, 32,000 on the 5D Mark IV. Let's find out if that's justified. So taking a look at the actual images here, we see kind of the general pattern, and that I do think that the noise is more pronounced here. I also think that the contrast is holding up better on the actual EOS R, and so that's your trade-off that I've seen. Again, here you've got a little bit better contrast that's holding up at this high ISO value, a little bit more detail rendered there, but also more pronounced noise. And so in some ways there's maybe a little bit more sharpening on the image, but also a little bit more contrast. But here I'm not seeing any kind of significant color banding. I think that there is the slightest bit of green cast that is starting to creep in there. So it's maybe not quite as neutral as what it's been. And but beyond that, I mean, it's still holding up pretty well. And if you look at like the writing here compared to here, just a little bit better contrast there, and likewise on these dials. Now looking up into the black area, it's blacker, you know, than what, and so that, remember too, this is a little bit higher, and there's definitely, you can see both some green and, you know, purple, magenta patches in there. But again, stepping back, if you're not looking at a pixel level, I mean, I would say that that is a generally, you know, useful image, particularly if you're shooting for reportage or you're downsampling to take down the actual noise patterns a little bit. So what happens if we compare it to another mirrorless body? And I'm going to show you a few other options. In this case, I have the new Fuji XT3 here on the right side. This is an APS-C sensor, but the Fuji's approach is that they feel with the technology they've got in their APS-C sensors that they can do as good a job as full frame. We're going to find out how that holds up. So here at ISO 1600, and as you can see, I'm using the Fuji XF 35mm f2 lens here. So let's jump in and let's look here at our amount of detail and noise. So if we start over here on the lens, what we're going to find is that, I mean, contrast actually looks really, really fantastic on the Fuji, and detail and noise is nicely controlled. I mean, I would say it looks probably a hair better, in my opinion, than what does the EOS R. Contrast here looks quite excellent on the Fuji, and like our detail here looks good, and you know, darks look a little bit darker and brights look, you know, essentially almost as bright. And as far as the detail here, it looks really fantastic, and you can tell depth of field is a little bit deeper. f5.6 on APS-C, of course, has a deeper depth of field at this distance than it does f5.6 on full frame. Looking inside the camera, I really like the way that light and shadows is handled there on the Fuji. So Fuji actually looks quite good here. Dials looks good. Looking up in this area, both of them are really, really smooth, and you know, not a whole lot to see. There may be a slight bit more fine noise there for the Fuji, but it's hard to detect much of a difference, and you know, a little bit more detail showing up there for the Fuji. So maybe a little better contrast for the Fuji sensor at ISO 1600. Now the XT3 actually caps its normal range at ISO 12,800. So here we're looking at, you know, essentially the upper limit without going into the expanded range. So let's see how it looks here. And so I would say, looking at our lens, like in this pattern, again, contrast looks really fantastic. So the image itself looks great, but I do think that there's more noise in the Fuji than what there is in the EOS R. And so look at here, you can see just in the reds, you can see more noise showing up there. And looking at the game here, what you can see is that in this kind of lighter area, there's more noise. You know, it's a fine noise and it's pretty clean looking, but there's definitely more of it than what there is on the EOS R. I still do favor the actual kind of contrast in the general look, and so I think that really, as far as usability, this looks pretty fantastic. And Fuji says that the way that their sensor is set up, this is not a Bayer sensor, that the noise is a little bit more randomized, and so it's a little bit more like film grain. I'll let you decide that for yourself. That's what they tell me, and so you can tell me if that's what you see or what you don't see. But I would say that the EOS R is giving us less noise at this equivalent ISO range, but I think that the Fuji is giving us a little bit better contrast and detail. So there's your trade-offs there. Okay, I'm also going to give you a look at a couple of Sony sensors to wrap this up. I wish I had the A7 III on hand. I don't. So I'm going to give you a look with the A6500, which is another APS-C body, and then also the A7 Mark III. And so I'm on both the Sony bodies. I'm using the Samyang AF 35mm f1.4. So taking a look, ISO 12,800. Looking at these two, Sony is actually metering quite a bit faster shutter speed here than what the Canon is, and so it has a little bit of advantage when it comes to contrast. I like the, again, the contrast look. I do also think though that the Sony has a, more noise that is showing up there. We'll take a look at our game here. And once again, I would say that, the noise is a little bit heavier. If we look up here into the umbrella portion, you can definitely see more of that noise pattern showing up here. Also, when it comes to the detail on the front of the camera, contrast and detail actually look quite good on the, the Sony body here compared to the Canon. And I would say that the noise here is, roughly equal. There's a crease contrast that helps the noise to show up a little bit more. Looking out into this area of the frame here, again, not yet a lot of color banding, and there's a difference in exposure value that kind of provides a little bit different. In some cases here, I have to kind of let the camera do some of the metering itself, because not all of these cameras have the same base ISO, and so it's a little bit hard to do a complete apples to apples comparison like in the case of the Fuji. So jumping up to 25,600, we'll take a look here at the detail, and once again we see that kind of the same pattern. Noise is a little bit more pronounced, but so is the detail. And you can see looking at this, there's definitely a heavier noise pattern in that area. And so, it kind of depends on what your priority is. Neither one of them is showing like color banding, discoloring in this area, but both have strengths and weaknesses, and it kind of depends on what your priority is going into this. Now pushed up to the very limits here, ISO 40,000, definitely heavier noise pattern on the Sony. The noise is rougher, coarser looking, and at the same time, however, both of them are managing to hold color fidelity fairly well, and so, but I mean, you definitely are starting to get a breakdown in terms of just how rough the noise pattern is on the Sony APS-C body in this area here. It's really, it's very coarse and very obvious compared to the Canon. So our final comparison will be with the EOS R to the A7R Mark III. Now, obviously the A7R Mark III is significantly higher resolution, and so in our final analysis, we'll take a look at a downsampled image that will give you a complete kind of apples to apples at a pixel level comparison. So with the A7R Mark III, and again, I'm using the Samyang AF on that, what we see here is at 12,800 is that we've got a pretty smooth looking result from the Sony that, of course, now we're back to a full frame sensor. And so, I mean, full frame sensors do have a bit of an advantage here. Lots of detail on the Sony, and noise right now, I would say, looks roughly the same as far as the noise in between them. And there's a little bit more detail on and more resolution on the Sony, so I would say that maybe it shows up a little bit more than what it does on the Canon. Let's take a look up in this area, and it's, as far as this dark area noise, it's really not all that dissimilar. And so, once again, the Sony meters with a little bit faster shutter speed than what does the Canon. Now, if we jump to 25,600, we're going to, of course, you're starting to push into higher limits there. Let me just jump back for a second. And looking at the image at large, what I am starting to see is a little bit of blotchiness on the Canon that I don't see on the Sony. The Sony does a really good job with this. Looking here, Sony is retaining better contrast, I would say. And again, noise is maybe a tiny bit more apparent at the added resolution of the Sony. Looking at this area here, once again, contrast is holding up, I would say well for both of them, but it's maybe a little bit more pronounced for the Sony. Looking at this, noise looks a little bit rougher because of the extra detail of the Sony. Looking at this area here, again, contrast looks better, but looking on the front facade of this, which is a smooth surface, you're seeing a little tiny bit more noise show up for the Sony there. Looking at our defocused area, however, it does stay more consistently even, whereas there's a little bit more color blotching on the Canon. So for our final comparison, we're going to look at the Sony and the EOS R, but this time with the Sony downsampled at 40,000. And so we have identical resolution now. And so kind of an apples to apples comparison on a pixel level reveals that the Sony is going to look a lot cleaner. The noise is less visible, contrast is superior. This is the advantage of a higher resolution sensor, and of course Sony's is very, very good at a high ISO performance. Looking up in this area, I mean, now it's the Canon that looks a little bit rougher in terms of the noise pattern, and contrast continues to favor the Sony. Looking here, detail looks, pretty fantastic here on the Sony compared to the Canon, and the noise is not any more pronounced. In our out of focus area, there's some of that banding that's showing up for the Canon that you're not really seeing on the Sony. And so at higher ISO levels, particularly if you're willing to do some downsampling, the A7R III definitely brings some advantages to the table when it comes to that. And so as you can see, in a lot of ways, the EOS R sensor does quite well at higher ISO values. It's kind of a give and take with the 5D Mark IV. They don't behave identically, and certainly you see a little bit more native contrast out of the EOS R sensor. You also see a little bit more sharpness maybe, and so the trade-off of that is that the sensor noise can be a little bit more noticeable at higher ISOs. But what we also saw is that it stayed pretty clean in terms of not putting in patches of discoloration or kind of a tint coming across it. And so it definitely doesn't behave identically to that of the 5D Mark IV, and we'll explore that a little bit more fully in some other episodes as well. Here I'll show you just a few kind of real-world high ISO shots. And so, I mean, it's one thing to look at in kind of a controlled test situation, but how do images look in the real world? And so you can see that for the most part, you really can get away at shooting at high ISOs here, and there's not really a big hit that you take from it. Stay tuned, and I will be back to you with more episodes in this series as I work towards a final verdict on the Canon EOS R. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my image gallery where I'm continuing to add images to it, both with the native kit lens 24-105, also with adapted lenses. And so far, everything that I've adapted has worked really well, and I'll talk to you more about that in the future. You can also find linkage if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and of course, there are links there if you'd like to follow me on social media or become a patron. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.